The fighting in the Burma Campaign in 1944 was among the most severe in the Southeast Asian theatre of World War II. It took place along the borders between Burma and India, and Burma and China, and involved the British Commonwealth, Chinese and United States forces, against the forces of the Empire of Japan and the Indian National Army. British Commonwealth land forces were drawn primarily from the United Kingdom, British India and Africa. The Allies had overcome the logistic and organisational difficulties which had crippled their earlier efforts, and they were preparing to invade Japanese-occupied Burma at several widely separated points. The Japanese forestalled them by launching their own offensive into India, and this offensive became larger in scope than originally intended. By the end of the year, the Allies had achieved significant territorial gains only in one sector, the extreme northeast of Burma. But the Japanese attack on India had been defeated with very heavy casualties. This handicapped the Japanese attempts to defend Burma against renewed Allied offensives in the following year. Rival plans. Allied plans. After the Japanese conquest of Burma in early 1942, the Allies had launched tentative counterattacks in late 1942 and early 1943. Despite lack of preparation and resources, this resulted in a defeat in the coastal Arakan province of Burma, and a questionable success in the first Chindit long-range raid into Burma. In August 1943, the Allies created Southeast Asia Command, a new combined command responsible for the Southeast Asian theatre. Its commander-in-chief was Admiral Louis Mountbatten. This brought a new sense of purpose, and in November, when SEAC took over responsibility for Burma, the newly formed British 14th Army was ready to take the offensive. The substantial improvement in the effectiveness of the troops which 14th Army inherited has been credited to its commander, Lieutenant General William Slim. He enforced the use of anti-malarial drugs as part of an emphasis on individual health, established realistic jungle warfare training, rebuilt the Army's self-respect by winning easy small-scale victories, and developed local military infrastructure. Slim's efforts were aided by improvements to the Allied supply lines. By October 1944, capacity on the Northeast Indian railways had been raised to 4,400 tons a day from 600 tons a day at the start of the war. The Allied Eastern Air Command, which consisted mainly of Royal Air Force squadrons but also several units of the Indian Air Force and bomber and transport units of the United States Army Air Forces, had gained air superiority, and this allowed the Allies to employ new tactics, relying upon air support and aerial resupply of troops. SEAC had to accommodate several rival plans. Admiral Mountbatten, with a background as a naval officer and having previously served as commander of Combined Operations HQ, favored amphibious landings. The first of these was to be on the Andaman Islands, but the landing craft assigned to the operation were recalled to Europe in preparation for the Normandy landings. The previous year, a British attack into the Burmese coastal province of Arakan had been heavily defeated. Having been reorganised, 15th Corps had taken over this part of the front and was preparing to renew the offensive with the aim of capturing Akub Island, important for its port and airfield. A limited amphibious move in support of this attack had to be abandoned for lack of the necessary landing craft and other shipping. The American aim in the China-Burma-India theater was to maintain military aid and supplies to the Republic of China under Chiang Kai-shek, with its wartime capital in Chongqing. They had established an air supply route, known as the Hump, over the Himalayas to Kunming in the Chinese province of Yunnan. Some Chinese forces which had retreated into India in early 1942 had been re-equipped and retrained by an American military mission under Lieutenant General Joseph Stilwell, who was also Chief of Staff to Chiang Kai-shek and Deputy Commander of SEAC. Stilwell proposed to construct a new road, the Ledo Road, to link India and China by land. Although British leaders were skeptical about the value of this road and the effort devoted to it, By the start of 1944, the new road had reached the far side of the Patkai Mountains, and Stilwell was preparing to advance on Kamaring and Myitkyina in northern Burma. Chiang Kai-shek had agreed to mount an offensive across the Salween River into eastern Burma from Yunnan. When the Andaman Island landings were cancelled, he claimed this was a breach of faith and cancelled the Yunnan offensive, although he later reinstated it. Following a long-distance raid in 1943 by a long-range penetration force known as the Chindits, British Major General Order Wingate had gained approval for the force and its scope of operations to be greatly expanded. This was opposed by Slim and others who felt that this was too great a drain on manpower and resources. But under political pressure from Winston Churchill, Wingate's plans went ahead. The Chindits, designated Indian 3rd Infantry Division for cover purposes, were tasked with assisting Stilwell by disrupting the Japanese lines of supply to the northern front. Wingate had originally planned that an airborne brigade would capture a Japanese-held airfield at Indore, which would then be garrisoned by a line infantry division as a base for further Chindit raids. This second part of the plan for Wingate's special force, which would have imposed heavy demands on the available transport aircraft and also required troops already allocated to other operations, was later dropped. After protracted staff discussions within India and between the Allied staffs and commanders in London, Washington, and Chungking, the Allied plans for 1944 were reduced to the offensive by Stilwell's Chinese troops from Ledo, the Chindit operation in support of Stilwell, the renewed overland attack in the Arakan, and a rather ill-defined offensive across the Chindwin River from Imphal in support of the other operations. Japanese plans. About the same time that SEAC was established, the Japanese had created a new headquarters, Burma Area Army, commanded by Lieutenant General Masakazu Kawabe. By chance or design, the new commander of 15th Army, Lieutenant General Renya Mutaguchi, had played a major part in many recent Japanese triumphs. He had, for example, been the officer immediately concerned in the Marco Polo Bridge incident in 1937, which started hostilities between Japan and China, and stated his belief that it was his destiny to win the war for Japan. He was keen to mount an offensive against India. Burma Area Army originally quashed this idea, but Mutaguchi's persistent advocacy won over officers at Southern Expeditionary Army Group at Singapore, the HQ of all Japanese forces in Southern Asia. Finally, Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo approved Mutaguchi's plan. Officers who opposed Mutaguchi's plans were transferred or sidelined. Neither Kawabe, nor Field Marshal Hisaichi Terauchi, the Commander-in-Chief of Southern Expeditionary Army Group, were given any opportunity to veto Mutaguchi's plan, or to control the operation once it had started. The Japanese were influenced to an unknown degree by Subhash Chandra Bose, commander of the Indian National Army. This was composed largely of Indian soldiers who had been captured in Malaya or Singapore, and some Tamil labourers living in Malaya. At Bose's instigation, a substantial contingent of the INA joined in this Chala Delhi. Both Bose and Mutaguchi emphasized the advantages which would be gained by a successful attack into India. With misgivings on the part of several of Mutaguchi's superiors and subordinates, Operation Yugo was launched. Northern Front. Stilwell's forces, the Northern Combat Area Command, initially consisted of two American-equipped Chinese divisions, with a Chinese-manned M3 light tank battalion and an American long-range penetration brigade known after its commander as Merrill's Marauders. 3 Chinese divisions were later flown from Yunnan to Ledo to reinforce Stilwell. In October 1943, the Chinese 38th Division, led by Sun Li-jen, began to advance from Ledo towards Xinjiang, while American engineers and Indian laborers extended the Ledo Road behind them. The Japanese 18th Division advanced to the Chindwin to stop them, but found itself outmatched. Whenever the Chinese 22nd and 38th Divisions ran into Japanese strong points, the Marauders were used to outflank Japanese positions by going through the jungle, a technique which had served the Japanese so well earlier in the war before the Allies had learnt the arts of jungle warfare was now being used against them. At Wallabam, for example, if the Chinese 38th Division had been a little swifter and linked up with the Marauders, it could have encircled the Japanese 18th Division. Not only were the Japanese driven back, but the Allies were able to use the trace of the track the Japanese had constructed to supply 18th Division, to speed their construction of the Ledo Road. Second Chindit Expedition. In Operation Thursday, the Chindits were to support Stilwell's advance by interdicting Japanese supply lines in the region of Indore. On 5 February 1944, Brigadier Bernard Ferguson's 16th Brigade set out from Ledo on foot. They crossed exceptionally difficult terrain which the Japanese had not guarded, and penetrated the Japanese rear areas. In early March, 3 other brigades were flown into landing zones behind Japanese lines by the USAAF 1st Air Commando Group, from where they established strongholds on most of the Japanese road and rail links to their northern front. Over the next 2.5 months, the Chindits were involved in many very heavy contacts with the Japanese. Brigadier Michael Calvert's 77th Brigade successfully defended one of the landing zones, code-named Broadway, and established a road and railway block at Morlu, north of Indore. This position, code-named the White City, was successfully held for several weeks. Not all communications to the Japanese northern front were blocked, as only a single Chindit battalion operated against the road from Barmo to Myitkyina, beyond the range of effective Allied air support. On 24 March, Ferguson's brigade attempted to capture the airfield at Indore but was repulsed, following which the exhausted brigade was withdrawn to India. On the same day, Wingate, the commander of the Chindits, was killed in an air crash. His replacement was Brigadier Joe Lenten, formerly the commander of the 111th Brigade, one of the Chindit formations. On 17 May, overall control of the Chindits was transferred from Slim's 14th Army to Stilwell's NCAC. The Chindits evacuated Broadway and the White City, and moved from the Japanese rear areas to new bases closer to Stilwell's front. They were given additional tasks for which they were not equipped. At the same time, the Japanese replaced the Scratch-Take Force, which had been trying to defend their rear areas, with the newly formed headquarters of the Japanese 33rd Army. Ing deployed 53rd Division against the Chindits. The 111th Brigade, now commanded by John Masters, tried to establish another road and rail block code-named Blackpool, near Hopen, but were forced to retreat after 17 days of battle. The monsoon had broken, making movement difficult and preventing the other Chindit formations reinforcing Masters's brigade. Calvert's 77th Brigade captured Mogarung after a siege which ended on 27 June, but at the cost of 50% casualties. By July, it was clear that the Chindits were exhausted by continuous marching and fighting under heavy monsoon rains, and were withdrawn. By the end of the campaign, the Chindits had lost 1,396 killed and 2,434 wounded. Over half the remainder had to be hospitalized with a special diet afterwards. The British 36th Division was transferred to Stilwell's command to replace the Chindits. Yunnan Front. The Chinese forces on the Yunnan Front mounted an attack starting in the second half of April, with nearly 40,000 troops crossing the Salween River on a 200 miles front. Within a few days, some 12 Chinese divisions, totaling 72,000 men under the command of General Wei Luang, were attacking the Japanese 56th Division. The Japanese forces in the north were now fighting on two fronts, against the Allies from the northwest and the nationalist Chinese from the northeast. The Chinese Yunnan offensive was hampered by the monsoon rains and lack of air support. but succeeded in surrounding the garrison of Tengchung at the end of May. After overcoming determined Japanese resistance, the Chinese captured Lungaling at the end of August. At this point, the Japanese moved reinforcements to Yunnan and counterattacked, temporarily halting the Chinese advance. Siege of Myitkyina. While the Japanese offensive on the Central Front was being waged, Stilwell's forces continued to make gains. On the 19th of May, the Chinese 22nd and 38th Divisions encircled Kamaring. 2 days before, on the 17th of May, Merrill's forces captured the airfield at Myitkyina after a march across the Kumornbum Mountains which nearly crippled the already weary marauders. If Chinese troops from Ledo had been flown in that afternoon to attack the town immediately, they could have overwhelmed the small garrison. But support and logistic units were flown in first and the opportunity to capture the town easily was lost. As Japanese reinforcements arrived in the town, the resulting prolonged siege was not very well directed and cost the Allies many men, particularly amongst the marauders who were kept in the line for reasons of American prestige, and among the Chindits who were forced to remain in the field to disrupt Japanese relief attempts far longer than had been planned. However, because of the deteriorating situation on the other fronts, the Japanese never regained the initiative on the northern front. The long siege also resulted in heavy Japanese losses. When the airfield was captured, the Japanese in the town at first intended to fight a delaying action only, aided by the monsoon rains. On the 10th of June, Major General Genzo Mizukami, who had been sent with reinforcements and placed in charge of the garrison, was ordered personally to defend Myitkyina to the death. The Japanese dug in and repelled several Chinese attacks. Further resistance appeared hopeless by the end of July. Mizukami evacuated the survivors of the garrison before fulfilling the letter of his orders by taking his own life inside the defended perimeter. Myitkyina was finally captured on the 3rd of August. The capture of Myitkyina marked the end of the initial phase of Stilwell's campaign. It was the largest seizure of Japanese-held territory to date in the Burma Campaign. The airfield at Myitkyina became a vital link in the air route over the hump. Southern Front 1943–44. In Arakan, 15th Corps, commanded by Lieutenant General Philip Christison, renewed the advance on the Mayu Peninsula. Ranges of steep hills channeled the advance into 3 attacks by 5th Indian Division along the coast, 7th Indian Division along the Kalapanzine River and 81st Division along the Kaladin River. The 5th Indian Division captured the small port of Mongdor on 9 January 1944. The Corps then prepared to capture 2 disused railway tunnels which linked Mongdor with the Kalapanzine Valley. However, the Japanese struck first. A strong force from the Japanese 55th Division infiltrated Allied lines to attack the 7th Indian Division from the rear, overrunning the divisional HQ. Unlike previous occasions on which this had happened, the Allied forces stood firm against the attack, and supplies were dropped to them by parachute. In the Battle of the Admin Box from the 5th of February to the 23rd of February, the Japanese concentrated on 15 Corps administrative area, defended mainly by service troops, but they were unable to deal with tanks supporting the defenders. Troops from 5th Indian Division broke through the Narkidok Pass to relieve the defenders of the box. Although battle casualties were approximately equal, the overall result was a heavy Japanese defeat. Their infiltration and encirclement tactics had failed to panic Allied troops, and as the Japanese were unable to capture enemy supplies, they themselves starved. 2 fresh Allied divisions took over the front in the Mayu Peninsula and resumed the offensive. However, 15 Corps' offensive wound down over the next few weeks, as the Allies concentrated their resources, particularly transport aircraft, on the Central Front. After capturing the railway tunnels and Sim Hills which dominated the Mongdor-Butherdyme Road, 15th Corps halted during the monsoon. Some ground in the malarial Kalapanzine Valley was given up to reduce losses to disease. and Japanese counter-attacks forced the isolated 81st Division to retreat up the Caledon Valley.